Seren did not scream when her Alpha King replaced her. She did not plead when his mistress took her bridal chambers. She simply closed her mouth and held her peace, knowing the weight of an unspoken name grows teeth. She knew that soon enough, the High Wolf King, Alistair Sterling, would march into their keep, point Stellivor, his ancient sword, at her chest, and call her silence the ultimate proof of treason against a false crown. The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. Everyone expected her to shatter, to collapse onto the cold stones and weep for the life that was being violently ripped away. They wanted to see the blood of her pride spilled across the floor. The grand hall of the Shadowstone Keep was a cavern of false promises. Towering pillars of cold iron stretched toward a vaulted ceiling, lost in the shadows of a sunless afternoon. Torches burned in gilded sconces, casting a flickering, jaundiced light across the polished marble floor. The air was overwhelmingly thick, with the heavy, strangling scent of jasmine perfume. It was entirely unnatural, completely overpowering the honest aroma of pine, wet earth, and winter winds that usually clung to the highland wolves. It smelled like a trap. It smelled like ruin. Seren Vantrell stood entirely alone at the exact center of the vast, open chamber. Her spine was a rod of forged steel. Her chin rested at a perfect, parallel angle to the floor. She wore a simple, unadorned dress of undyed wool, having been stripped of the heavy silver, silks, and furs that rightfully belonged to her station. The bitter cold from the marble seeped relentlessly through the thin leather soles of her shoes, creeping up her calves in a deliberate attempt to freeze the blood in her veins. She did not shiver. She did not let them see a single, solitary tremor of weakness. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a dais of dark, polished mahogany, sat Thomas Blackwood. The Alpha King of the local pack slouched on a throne that was entirely too large for his frame. His posture was an artificial display of dominance. His shoulders were squared, his jaw tight and grinding with the profound insecurity of a man who ruled exclusively through fear rather than earned respect. His eyes, which had once looked at her with the tentative, golden warmth of a fated mate, were now flat, hard, and hollow. They were the eyes of a coward hiding behind an inherited crown. Beside him stood Lyra Thorne. The mistress wore a gown of spun silver, the exquisite fabric cascading around her delicate frame like liquid moonlight. Her manicured hands rested possessively, triumphantly, on the carved arm of the throne. On her index finger, heavy and undeniable, sat the lunar crest ring. The cold moonstone caught the torchlight, flashing with an icy, mocking glare that demanded acknowledgement. It was an ancient, sacred relic of Seren's own bloodline. It had been violently pulled from her finger only hours before by Thomas's own hands. A faint, purpling bruise still ringed Seren's bare digit, a throbbing, aching phantom of the authority they had stolen. The entire court watched in a stifling, predatory silence. Hundreds of wolves from the upper echelon of the pack lined the walls, standing shoulder to shoulder in their fine velvets and ceremonial armors. Their eyes were hungry, waiting for the highly anticipated spectacle of a shattered woman. They expected tears. They expected begging. They wanted the pitiful, dramatic collapse of a displaced mate who had dared to believe she was fundamentally safe in her own home. Seren offered them nothing. Her inner wolf did not pace. Her inner wolf did not whimper or scrape against the walls of her mind. She simply sat back in the dark, quiet recesses of her consciousness, watching the pathetic charade with absolute, cold disdain. Seren of the House Vantrell, Thomas's voice echoed loudly through the cavernous space. It was artificially amplified by the acoustics of the grand hall, a deliberate trick designed to mask the slight, nervous tremor in his tone. By the ancient rights of the Blackwood pack, and under the witness of this court, I hereby sever the mate bond. I strip you of your title. You are no longer Luna. The words struck the air like physical, blunt force blows. the sacred thread woven between their souls, a biological and magical bond meant to last centuries, violently stretched, tore, and bled. The physiological agony was immense, blinding in its intensity. A phantom fire erupted in the exact center of her chest, a raw, tearing sensation that radiated outward, down her arms, straight to her fingertips. Spidery patterns of ice crawled beneath her skin, warring with the burning heat of the rejection. Her core temperature plummeted drastically. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and stark as winter frost. She did not gasp. She did not clutch her chest. She slowly, deliberately inhaled through her nose, holding the icy breath deep in lungs until the sharpest peak of the agony finally passed. "I have chosen a true partner," the man continued, gesturing with a heavy hand to the woman standing at his side. Lyra offered a fragile, venomous smile, her triumphant gaze fixed solely on the woman standing below her. "Lyra is your Luna now. You will surrender your chambers immediately. You will take your place among the lowest caste of the keep. You will serve in the dampness of the kitchens." A collective, hushed murmur rippled aggressively through the gathered nobility. The demotion was staggering, almost unheard of in modern times. To fall from the high seat of power to the damp, forgotten cellars was a humiliation, meticulously designed to crush a person's spirit entirely. It was an execution of identity. Thomas leaned forward, his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped the wooden arms of his chair. He needed something from her. He desperately needed vocal validation for his cruelty to secure his shifting authority. "Step forward, servant. Speak your oath of submission to your new Luna. Acknowledge her rule before this court, and I will permit you to remain within these walls." Silence. It was not a passive, empty silence. It was heavy, dense, and physically absolute. It filled the cavernous hall, expanding outward from the solitary, unmoving figure in the center of the floor, pressing uncomfortably against the eardrums of every wolf in the room. Seren looked at him. She looked at the man who had whispered promises of safety in the dark, who had foolishly traded a sacred, fated alliance for the instant, shallow gratification of a manipulative mistress. She analytically catalogued the nervous twitch in his jaw, the slight sheen of sweat gathering at his temples despite the chill in the room. He was weak. He was a small, frightened thing, pretending to be a god. "Speak the oath," Thomas commanded, his voice cracking slightly on the final, desperate syllable. The mistress shifted uncomfortably, the heavy silver ring clinking sharply against the wood of the throne. The fragile, sweet smile faltered entirely, abruptly replaced by a flicker of genuine, ugly irritation. "Compel her to say it, Thomas," Lyra whispered urgently, her high voice carrying much further than she intended in the quiet room. Seren did not blink. She kept her stormy, silver-grey eyes locked firmly on the Alpha. She saw the exact moment genuine panic bloomed in his chest. A ruler's power relied entirely on the vocal acknowledgement of his subjects. A spoken oath was the ultimate, binding currency of the pack. By refusing to speak, she was actively denying him the very foundation of his authority. Her silence was absolute. It was beautiful the way a freshly sharpened blade was beautiful. "If you do not speak," the Alpha gritted out, abruptly standing up from his seat, his broad shoulders tensing defensively under his velvet tunic, "you will be treated as a traitor to the crown. You will be assigned the hardest, most grueling labor. You will rot in the dark until you forget your own name." Still, she said absolutely nothing. The air in the hall grew uncomfortably cold, devoid of any emotional warmth. The nobles shifted nervously on their feet, exchanging worried, sideways glances in mounting unease. The grand spectacle was crumbling before their eyes. The designated victim was refusing to bleed for them. Seren held his furious, unstable gaze for 3 more agonizingly long heartbeats. Then, with a slow, deliberate, and devastatingly graceful movement, she turned her back on the throne. The collective gasp from the crowd was loud and audible. Turning one's back on an alpha without receiving explicit permission was a profound, unforgivable insult. It was a physical, visual rejection of his very existence. She walked steadily toward the heavy oak doors at the rear of the hall. Her steps were perfectly measured, her leather shoes striking the cold marble with soft, even, rhythmic sounds. She did not rush, she did not look back. Every single eye in the vast room was fixed securely on the straight, unyielding, unbroken line of her spine. "Stop her!" Lyra shrieked, her voice turning shrill, harsh, and desperate, entirely shattering the quiet, imposing dignity of the moment. "Make her bow to me." The heavily armored guards, stationed at the grand doors, tensed instantly, their leather-gloved hands dropping instinctively to the cold hilts of their swords. They looked anxiously toward their leader, waiting for the official order to strike the former Luna down. Thomas raised a visibly trembling hand, signaling the guards to stand down. He could not execute her in front of the entire court without looking like a paranoid, unstable tyrant butchering a defenseless woman. He was completely trapped in the intricate web of his own public, theatrical display. The heavy oak doors groaned open loudly, and Seren stepped out of the jaundiced, fake light of the hall, leaving the cloying scent of jasmine far behind. She reached the stone spiral staircase, descending slowly and deliberately into the dark, damp belly of the keep. She vanished like smoke through a crack in the world. The dungeons and lower cellars were where you went to be forgotten. The crushing, heavy silence of the spiraling stairwell felt like a physical descent into the underworld. The damp walls wept with centuries of condensed moisture and forgotten secrets. With every single step downward, the stifling, residual stench of the grand hall faded, gradually replaced by the stark, pungent reality of the subterranean world. The physical environment shifted drastically the moment Seren passed the third landing of the stairs. The perfectly polished marble gave way abruptly to rough, uneven, damp cobblestones. The oppressive, gilded torches were replaced by the erratic, smoky, unpredictable glow of heavy iron braziers. The air down here was entirely different. It smelled intensely of raw earth, roasted root vegetables, sharp wood smoke, and the faint, lingering metallic tang of old blood. It was harsh, uncompromising, but it was honest, and for the first time since the devastating rejection, Seren's lungs expanded in a full, genuine breath. She finally reached the bottom of the long stairs and stepped into the sprawling, cavernous, subterranean kitchens. The intense, radiating heat of the massive hearthfires hit her skin like a physical, comforting weight, instantly thawing the lingering, bitter chill of the upper levels. Giant, black iron cauldrons bubbled continuously over roaring, golden flames, tended diligently by dozens of men and women whose faces were deeply streaked with soot and chronic exhaustion. This was the lowest caste of the Blackwood pack, the unranked, the invisible workers who kept the keep breathing. When the former Luna stepped fully into the erratic light, the chaotic, rhythmic chopping of heavy knives and the loud clatter of iron spoons ceased abruptly. Dozens of wary, tired eyes turned toward her simultaneously. They had all felt the devastating snap of the mate bond. The biological, magical shockwave had rippled violently down through the stone floors, alerting every single wolf in the massive keep to the tragedy occurring above. Seren did not shrink from their intense, evaluating stares. She simply walked with quiet purpose to a heavy, scarred wooden prep table near the largest roaring hearth, picked up a coarse, stiff, bristled brush, and waited. An older, sturdy woman stepped forward from the shadows, slowly wiping her flour-dusted hands on a heavily stained linen apron. Martha Crowley was a permanent fixture of the lower keep, a woman with deep, permanent lines etched around her dark eyes and the sturdy, unmovable physical presence of an ancient oak tree. She was the unofficial, undisputed matriarch of the kitchens, fiercely and violently protective of her underground domain. Martha looked critically at the young woman standing in the plain, undyed wool dress. She carefully noted the pale, bloodless quality of her skin, the dark, bruised circles forming under her strange, silver-grey eyes, and the rigid, unwavering, defensive posture. She saw the phantom, screaming agony of the severed mate bond hidden perfectly behind the girl's quiet, stoic demeanor. "They sent you down here to break," Martha said bluntly. Her voice was a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the loud, popping crackle of the hearth fire. Seren met the older woman's assessing gaze directly. She did not nod in agreement. She did not shake her head in denial. She simply maintained strong, unwavering eye contact, her strange, stormy eyes holding a profound depth of sorrow and strategic resolve that spoken words could never adequately capture. Martha sighed heavily, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to carry years of accumulated, generational exhaustion. "There are no queens in the cellar, girl, only calluses and ash." The senior servant reached under the heavy wooden table, pulled out a large, heavy iron bucket filled to the brim with steaming, soapy water, and set it on the stone floor with a loud clang. She did not offer sweet words or pity. Pity was a useless luxury the lower caste could never afford to entertain. Seren dropped to her knees on the rough, unforgiving stone floor. The harsh impact sent a sharp, bruising jolt of pain directly up her shins, but she actively welcomed the intense physical sensation. It instantly anchored her to the present moment. It helped drown out the persistent, agonizing, hollow echo of the broken bond bleeding in her chest. She plunged the stiff bristle brush into the scalding hot water, completely ignoring the way it immediately burned her knuckles red, and began to forcefully scrub the deep, grease-stained stones. Every rough drag of the stiff bristles against the ancient stone was a deliberate, calculated exertion of control. She focused entirely on the microscopic details of her brutal labor, the way the grey soap violently churned into white froth, the way the hot steam aggressively curled into the damp, freezing air, the way the dark grease slowly surrendered to her raw, bleeding knuckles. It was a punishing, physical grounding technique. By intentionally forcing her mortal body to endure the burning heat of the water and the harsh bite of the cobblestones, she successfully denied the hollow, screaming void in her chest the opportunity to consume her mind. She would not let the severed bond break her sanity. She would scrub the floors until her flesh peeled, but she would not shed a single tear for the coward sitting on the throne above. She worked tirelessly until her hands were completely raw and aggressively blistered, until the tight muscles in her lower back screamed in burning protest, until the sweat plastered her dark, loose hair to her forehead and neck. The physical, back-breaking labor was brutal, but it was a rhythmic, necessary, meditative distraction. The repetitive, circular motion was an anchor, dragging her forcefully away from the abyss of the hollowed-out cavern where her mate bond had once thrived. For the next several weeks, Seren lived in absolute, unbroken silence. She never spoke a single, solitary word, not when the heavy, boiling iron pots accidentally burned her forearms. Not when the damp, biting cold of the deep cellar seeped painfully into her joints during the lonely, quiet hours of the night. Not when the arrogant guards from the upper levels came down to demand extra, unearned rations, deliberately kicking over buckets of freshly cleaned water just to lazily watch her scrub the floors all over again. Her silence became a tangible, living entity within the kitchens. It was a massive, protective shield, thick and entirely impenetrable. Seren was very good at being unseen. She quickly learned the exact, chaotic rhythm of the subterranean kitchens, moving through the dangerous, crowded space with a fluid, ghostly, efficient grace. She anticipated needs long before they were ever voiced, smoothly sliding a sharp, paring knife into a butcher's hand just as he blindly reached for it, or swiftly pulling a boiling heavy pot off the fire a fraction of a second before it boiled over onto the ashes. The lower servants watched her closely. They saw the way she bore the petty daily cruelty of the upper guards, without a single flinch or whimper. They saw the quiet, respectful dignity in the way she meticulously mended the torn, soot-stained tunics of the young kitchen boys by the dim, fading light of the dying embers long after everyone else had gone to sleep. She was no longer their Luna in official title, but through her actions she was rapidly becoming something far more deeply respected. She was becoming their absolute anchor. By the 3rd month of her quiet exile, a highly volatile altercation occurred. 2 silver-armored guards from the upper hall swaggered loudly into the kitchens, reeking heavily of cheap, sour wine and unearned arrogance. They aggressively demanded fresh roasted meat, furious and shouting that the daily, allotted rations had already been distributed to the workers. "Find us something to eat, or we'll take it out of your old hide." One of the men snarled viciously, violently shoving Martha against the sharp edge of the heavy wooden prep table. Before the older, stunned servant could even attempt to recover her balance, Seren was there. She moved with absolute, terrifying silence, stepping smoothly and purposefully between the drunken, aggressive guard and the kitchen matriarch. She did not raise a weapon. She did not raise her raw, blistered fists. She simply stood her ground, her silver-grey gaze locking intensely onto the man's flushed face. The guard sneered ugly, raising his heavy, gauntleted hand to physically strike the mute, displaced girl out of his path. "Move out of the way, you broken bitch." He never landed the blow. A sudden, intense pressure instantly filled the warm room. The kitchen boys quietly dropped their paring knives. The massive butchers stepped silently forward from the dark shadows of the hanging meats. 6, then 10, then 15 of the lower servants moved in perfect, silent, deadly synchronicity, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of bodies directly behind Seren. No one spoke. No one shouted a dramatic challenge. They just stood there, heavily armed with heavy cast-iron skillets, wickedly sharp meat cleavers, and heavy pots of boiling water, their eyes fixed on the 2 intruders with absolute, lethal intent. The unspoken message was glaringly clear. She belonged to them now. To strike her was to strike the very foundation of the keep, and they would butcher anyone who tried. The guard's raised hand faltered awkwardly in mid-air. The crushing, heavy weight of the collective, unyielding silence completely shattered his drunken bravado. He looked nervously at the unblinking, stoic face of the displaced queen, then at the massive wall of quiet, deadly loyalty standing behind her. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room, took a shaky step back and quickly turned away, aggressively dragging his confused companion out of the cellars without uttering another word. When the heavy iron-bound wooden door shut securely behind them, the thick tension in the room finally broke. The servants smoothly returned to their tasks, the rhythmic chopping and clattering seamlessly resuming as if the violent threat had never even happened. Martha adjusted at her stained apron, her hands shaking slightly from the sudden spike of adrenaline. She looked at Seren, specifically noting the way the young woman's defensive posture had not relaxed, the way her unbent spine remained a constant physical testament to her unbroken will. The older woman reached out cautiously, her rough, flour-covered hand gently touching the girl's tense shoulder. It was the absolute first act of gentle, safe physical contact she had received since the brutal rejection ceremony. The touch was warm, heavy, and deeply grounding. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself," Martha whispered softly, the usually gravelly voice softening into something closely resembling maternal warmth. "We know exactly who you are." Seren looked down at the sturdy hand resting on her shoulder. The comforting warmth seeped slowly through the thin, undyed wool of her dress, providing a stark, emotional contrast to the freezing, humiliating betrayal of the Grand Hall. She did not smile, she did not cry, but the tight, frozen, painful knot in the center of her chest loosened just a fraction of an inch. She reached up slowly and briefly covered the older woman's hand with her own blistered, raw, hard-working fingers, a silent acknowledgement, a silent, unbreakable vow. They buried the old, naive Luna at midnight in the damp cellars where no one would ever think to look, replacing her entirely with a silent ghost who commanded the shadows of the keep. Thomas Blackwood smugly thought he had utterly destroyed her by stripping away her voice, her ring, and her title. He thought he had successfully cast her into the dark, to be ignored and forgotten. He didn't know that the dark was exactly where roots grew the strongest. He didn't know that every single day she spent in absolute, unyielding silence was another heavy stone added to the massive fortress she was meticulously building around herself. And he certainly didn't know that hundreds of miles away, the storm-grey eyes of the true High Sovereign, Alistair Sterling, were already turning toward their borders. Accompanied by his loyal captain, Garrick Dane, the High Wolf King was riding hard, drawn relentlessly by the undeniable scent of broken treaties and the heavy, ominous weight of silent treason. The winter solstice banquet was supposed to be the most sacred, unifying night of the year for the Blackwood pack. Instead, it had become a hollow, agonizing display of a fractured court. The grand hall was draped in heavy crimson velvet and excessive gold trim, a desperate, gaudy attempt to mask the profound, creeping decay of the pack's morale. Hundreds of thick beeswax candles burned fiercely in the high iron chandeliers, dripping hot wax onto the polished marble below, yet the vast chamber felt impossibly cold. The oppressive, cloying stench of jasmine perfume clung desperately to the air, battling a losing war against the underlying metallic tang of unease, human sweat, and souring wine. At the head table, Thomas Blackwood sat rigidly on his oversized mahogany throne. He wore a tunic of deep emerald silk, his chest puffed out in a manufactured display of absolute authority. But the fine clothes could not hide the dark, sunken circles beneath his eyes, nor the frantic, restless twitch of his jaw. The Alpha King was slowly unraveling. Beside him, Lyra Thorne stood to deliver the traditional solstice blessing. She was draped in layers of shimmering silver silk, her golden hair intricately braided with diamonds. She raised her hand, proudly displaying the lunar crest ring to the assembled nobility, but the ancient moonstone, which used to glow with a warm, pearlescent inner light when the true queen wore it, was completely dark. It sat on the mistress's finger, like a dead, heavy piece of cloudy glass, completely devoid of any magical resonance. May the winter winds spare our borders, and may the hearth fires keep our bonds strong, Lyra projected, her voice high and unnaturally sweet, desperate for validation. I, your Luna, bless this harvest. She waited for the traditional, magical resonance, the deep, biological thrum of the pack bond expanding through the room, warming the blood of every wolf present. It was supposed to be a visceral, physical wave of safety and unity. Nothing happened. The air remained flat, stagnant, and bitterly cold. The blessing did not take. The sacred instinctual magic of the pack required absolute, authentic truth to function. It required a mate bond forged by fate, not a shallow imitation sealed by infidelity and stolen rings. The biological network of the pack was actively rejecting the mistress's voice. A stifling, suffocating awkwardness settled over the hundreds of nobles. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging dark, nervous glances. The roasted venison on their golden plates suddenly tasted like dry ash. The rich, heavily spiced wines turned sour and heavy on their tongues. They were eating a feast of lies, and their inner wolves were aggressively rejecting it. Adding to the profound, psychological torture of the evening was the terrifying behavior of the lower caste. Dozens of kitchen servants moved silently through the grand hall, carrying massive silver platters and heavy pitchers of wine. But they did not speak. They did not smile. They did not lower their eyes in traditional submission when the false Luna barked impatient orders at them. They simply stared through the mistress with hollow, blank expressions, filling her goblet in absolute, unyielding silence before drifting away like spectres. It was a coordinated, bloodless rebellion, a silent siege waged by the invisible hands that kept the keep breathing, orchestrated entirely by the quiet devotion they held. For the woman suffering in the cellars below. Thomas gripped his golden goblet so tightly the soft metal began to warp and dent under his white knuckles. He could physically feel the respect of his pack slipping through his fingers like dry sand. He needed vocal validation. He desperately needed his people to loudly proclaim their loyalty. But the absolute silence of the servants was a highly contagious disease, slowly infecting the nobility. Miles away from the suffocating, jasmine-scented decay of the Blackwood Keep, the heavy, honest scent of ozone, freezing rain, and crushed pine needles dominated the rugged highland pass. The true High Wolf King was riding. Alistair Sterling, the supreme sovereign of the ancient packs, sat atop a massive, midnight black warhorse. He did not wear the gaudy, decorative silks favoured by the lesser, cowardly alphas of the lowlands. He wore armour of dark, forged steel and a heavy cloak of raw direwolf fur that absorbed the biting winter wind. His physical presence was a terrifying, elemental force of nature. He was a man who had spent decades mastering the violent, lethal instincts of his inner beast, possessing a quiet, terrifying stillness that demanded absolute, biological submission from anyone who dared to stand in his path. The rumours surrounding his royal lineage were steeped in dark, bloody, Gothic folklore. No woman ever survived him. The cowardly lords whispered in their cups, speaking of a cursed, ancient bloodline that froze the weak and demanded a mate of unimaginable fortitude. He was a king who lived in isolation, bound by the heavy iron chains of his own immense power. His steely, piercing eyes, sharp and predatory, were entirely focused on the distant, jagged horizon where the Blackwood territory began. Riding precisely half a pace behind him was Garrick Dane. The fiercely loyal captain of the silver-armoured High Guard was a battle-hardened veteran, his face scarred and weather-beaten from countless border wars. The latest scouting reports from the southern ridge have been officially confirmed, sire, Garrick rumbled, his deep voice effortlessly cutting through the howling wind. The Blackwood borders are completely rotting from the inside out. Their outer patrols have missed 3 consecutive shift changes. The perimeter wards are flickering, completely drained of their core magic. Alistair did not turn his head. He simply adjusted his leather-gloved grip on the thick leather reins. A pack's defense is directly tied to the strength of its Luna's bond. If the borders are failing, the center is already dead. There is more, my king, the captain continued, urging his horse slightly closer to navigate the treacherous, icy path. Our spies within the keep report a strange, psychological sickness spreading through the lower caste. The servants have completely stopped responding to the Alpha's orders. They perform their manual duties, but they do not speak a single word to the crown. They are silently resisting the new order. The keep is paralyzed by it. Alistair's eyes narrowed slightly, a microscopic shift in his otherwise impenetrable, stoic expression. He understood the immense, strategic weight of silence. He understood that in a world governed by loud roars, aggressive posturing, and violent physical dominance, refusing to speak was the most dangerous, profound weapon a truly unbent spine could wield. The Treaty of Ashna demands a legitimate fated ruler on the Blackwood throne to maintain the Highland alliances, the king said, his voice a low, dangerous gravel that seemed to vibrate heavily in the cold air. His gloved hand moved instinctively to rest on the heavy, silver-etched hilt of Stellavor, the ancient royal sword strapped to his hip. The false Alpha believes he can sever a fated bond, discard his true mate, and replace it with a cheap imitation without consequence. Garrick nodded grimly, the heavy silver plates of his armor clinking sharply against the cold wind. He foolishly believes the discarded queen will simply fade away in the dark cellars. He thinks the pack will forget her. Alistair's lips curved into a cold, microscopic phantom of a smile. It was a terrifying expression, completely devoid of any genuine warmth, promising absolute, ruinous justice. "A name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, my king," Garrick muttered, reciting an old, violent Highland proverb about buried betrayals. "Indeed, Garrick," Alistair agreed quietly, his striking silver gaze fixing intensely on the distant, dark silhouette of the stone keep rising against the stormy night sky. "We are small things in a world of teeth. But some women do not need fangs to tear a kingdom apart. They only need to close their mouths and let the guilty choke on their own sins." The High King spurred his massive horse forward, aggressively accelerating the punishing pace. He was not just riding to enforce a broken legal treaty. He was riding to witness the sheer, terrifying willpower of a woman who was actively bringing an entire, corrupt pack to its knees without shedding a single drop of blood or speaking a single word. He was riding for the Silent Queen. Back in the claustrophobic depths of the Shadowstone Keep, the heavy, uncoordinated thud of leather boots echoing violently down the spiral stone staircase signaled the arrival of a broken man. Thomas could not endure the public humiliation of the banquet for another second. The silent, judging eyes of the servants and the hollow, dead magic of the pack had finally driven him into a state of blind, frantic panic. The invisible walls of his own fortress were closing in on him. He needed to fix the fracture. He desperately needed the one thing he had so arrogantly thrown away. The physical environment shifted drastically as he descended into the subterranean kitchens. The cold, jasmine-scented marble of the upper hall was abruptly replaced by the stifling, oppressive heat of the massive roaring hearths. The air down here was thick with the honest, heavy scents of lye soap, boiled beef bones, sharp wood smoke and raw earth. It was a domain of grueling labor and quiet survival, a stark, undeniable contrast to the gilded lies he sat upon above. The moment the Alpha burst through the heavy iron-bound door, the erratic, chaotic symphony of the kitchens ceased instantly. The rhythmic chopping of heavy meat cleavers stopped mid-swing. The loud clatter of iron spoons against heavy cauldrons died abruptly. Dozens of soot-stained servants froze in place, turning their wary, exhausted eyes toward the intruder. His face was flushed, a dark, angry red, and his fine emerald silk tunic was heavily wrinkled and stained with a dark splash of spilled wine. He looked entirely pathetic, completely stripped of his regal, terrifying facade by his own mounting insecurities. "Out!" Thomas screamed, his voice cracking violently in the damp, smoky air. He pointed a trembling, manic finger at the heavy wooden door, his chest heaving with exertion. "All of you, out of this room immediately!" Martha Crowley gripped the thick iron handle of her skillet, her jaw set in a hard, defiant line. The massive butchers stepped forward from the shadows, their broad shoulders blocking the narrow stone aisles. No one moved to obey the crown. They did not recognize his authority down here in the ash. They only recognized hers. At the far end of the long wooden prep table, Seren Vantrell slowly stopped scrubbing the deep iron cauldron. She wore her simple undyed wool dress, the hem heavily stained with dark grease and soapy water. Her hands were raw, red, and fiercely blistered from months of punishing, unforgiving labor. But her posture was utterly impeccable. Her spine was perfectly straight, her chin held high with the innate biological dignity of a true sovereign who refused to break. She looked at the angry mob of protective servants, taking in their silent loyalty, then gave a slow, deliberate, microscopic nod. It was the only command they needed. Slowly, reluctantly, the kitchen workers backed away, their worn boots shuffling against the stone floor as they melted silently into the dark shadows of the adjoining cellars. They left the false king alone with the ghost he had created. Thomas paced erratically across the damp, uneven cobblestones. He kicked a wooden bucket full of dirty water, sending it crashing violently against the stone wall. The loud, hollow sound echoed sharply in the quiet room, a pathetic display of physical temper. "You did this," Thomas snarled, pointing his shaking finger at her, his chest heaving with frantic, uneven breaths. "You are deliberately poisoning my court. You are telling them to defy me with your pathetic, arrogant silence." Seren did not stop her work. She calmly picked up a coarse, heavy rag and began to methodically polish a cast-iron skillet. The repetitive circular motion was her anchor, a physical action that kept her entirely grounded in the present moment. She completely ignored his outburst, dismissing his very existence with a cold, devastating apathy. He stepped closer, aggressively invading her physical space. He reached out and grabbed her upper arm. The physical touch, which used to send warm, fated sparks across her skin, now felt utterly repulsive and foreign. His grip was bruising, his fingers digging painfully into her tense muscle, but she did not flinch. She did not whimper. She slowly, deliberately raised her head and locked her stormy, silver-grey eyes directly onto his. Her gaze was an icy, impenetrable void. She was no longer a discarded victim waiting for a rescue that would never come. She was a weapon forged in the dark, not used, not owned, chosen. She had actively chosen this punishing silence. She had consciously chosen to weaponize her own unyielding dignity against his profound cowardice. The Alpha dropped her arm instantly, stumbling back a half-step, as if her pale skin had suddenly burned him. He was completely terrified by the sheer intensity of her absolute indifference. It was a coldness that ran deeper than the winter winds outside. "Just speak," he pleaded, his voice suddenly shifting from angry, roaring dominance to a pathetic, desperate beg. The sudden emotional whiplash was jarring, revealing the true depths of his panic. "Just give me one word. Come up to the Grand Hall tomorrow. Stand before the elders and publicly acknowledge Lyra's blessing. Tell them you accept her rule. If you do this small thing, I will give you a comfortable room in the upper keep. I will give you warm silks. You won't have to break your back on these damp stones ever again." She stared at him in heavy, unbroken silence. She analytically catalogued his sweaty brow, his bloodshot, terrified eyes, and the desperate, hollow set of his trembling jaw. He was offering her a pathetic, gilded cage in exchange for the only true power she had left. He was begging a servant to legitimize a king. Seren closed her lips even tighter, forming a grim, unbreakable iron line. She turned her gaze back to the heavy skillet, picking up her coarse rag once more, completely dismissing his desperate negotiations, as if he were nothing more than a passing draught of wind. Thomas lost his mind. He violently grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the table and hurled it blindly across the room. It smashed against the ancient stone wall with a deafening, violent crash, sending a shower of orange sparks flying into the damp, freezing air. "I am your Alpha," he roared, spittle flying from his pale lips, his eyes wide with unhinged, feral fury. "I command you to speak to me." Seren stood up slowly. She calmly wiped her raw, blistered hands on her soot-stained linen apron. She squared her shoulders, standing perfectly straight. She was a full head shorter than him, but in the dim, smoky, erratic light of the cellar hearth, her immense, unyielding presence towered over his trembling frame. She looked deep into his panicked, wide eyes. Her inner wolf, which had been quietly observing from the dark recesses of her mind, stepped forward, baring its teeth in a silent, predatory smile. She did not whimper. She did not plead. She simply stood there, an immovable mountain of cold stone, watching him break against the iron wall of her absolute silence. The silence stretched between them. It was heavy, suffocating, and physically absolute. It pressed violently against Thomas's chest, squeezing the oxygen directly from his lungs. He realized, with a cold, terrifying clarity, that he could not force her. He could not torture a single syllable out of a woman who had already accepted the absolute worst he could legally do to her. Her silence was a fortress he completely lacked the artillery to breach. He took a shaky step back, his fine leather boots slipping slightly on the damp, soapy cobblestones. His entire foundation of false authority had been completely shattered by a woman who hadn't spoken a single word in months. Without another sound, Thomas turned his back. He fled toward the heavy wooden door, practically running up the dark spiral staircase, desperately fleeing from the terrifying, silent ghost he had foolishly created. The heavy door slammed shut, echoing loudly through the massive chamber, plunging the kitchen back into its familiar, quiet rhythm. Seren calmly walked over to the corner, picked up the fallen skillet, her hands perfectly steady, and went silently back to work. The dawn brought absolutely no relief to the suffocating confines of the Blackwood Keep. The grand hall remained a stagnant, miserable cavern, still reeking heavily of spilled stowers of wine and the nauseating, cloying scent of jasmine perfume that had utterly failed to mask the disaster of the winter solstice banquet. The hundreds of thick beeswax candles had long since burned down to uneven, waxy stubs in their heavy iron chandeliers, leaving the vast marble chamber trapped in a dim, bruised, and miserable morning twilight. Exhausted, paranoid nobles lingered in small, nervous clusters near the gilded pillars, speaking in hushed, terrified whispers about the dead magic of the pack. The tension in the room was a physical, strangling weight, thick enough to choke on. Then the world shattered. The massive, ancient oak and iron front gates of the keep did not simply swing open to admit visitors. They exploded inward with a deafening, violent crack that sounded like a mountain splitting in two. Heavy, jagged splinters of ancient timber rained down upon the polished marble floor. A shrieking, violent howl of Highland winter wind rushed instantly into the stagnant, overheated hall, completely obliterating the sickening smell of jasmine in a single, freezing heartbeat. The sudden drastic drop in barometric pressure caused the remaining torches in the gilded sconces to instantly snuff out, plunging the grand entrance into deep, terrifying shadows. Through the swirling vortex of fresh, biting snow and freezing wind, a nightmare walked into the Blackwood Court. Alistair Stirling did not wait to be announced. The supreme sovereign of the ancient packs crossed the shattered threshold with the slow, devastating, and inevitable grace of an avalanche. He wore a massive, heavy cloak of raw, midnight black direwolf fur, the thick pelt heavily dusted with frost and melting snow. Beneath the fur, his broad, imposing frame was clad in dark, forged steel armor that seemed to actively absorb the weak morning light rather than reflect it. His physical presence was a terrifying, elemental force. The moment his heavy, steel-toed boots struck the polished marble floor, a massive, biological shockwave of absolute dominance rippled violently through the cavernous room. It was not a demand for respect. It was an instinctual, genetic absolute. The lesser wolves of the local nobility did not consciously choose to submit. Their knees simply buckled. Dozens of proud, arrogant lords and ladies collapsed heavily onto the freezing stone, gasping for breath as the sheer, crushing weight of the sovereign's aura pressed relentlessly against their lungs. Their inner wolves whimpered in the dark, forcefully driving them downward, pinning them to the floor in absolute, terrifying reverence. Flanking the sovereign was Garrick Dane. The fiercely loyal captain of the High Guard stepped through the ruined gates, his own hand resting casually but lethally on the hilt of his broadsword. Behind him, 24 elite soldiers filed into the hall in perfect, deadly synchronicity. They wore armor of gleaming, polished silver, moving with absolute silence, fanning out to instantly secure every visible exit. They were not an escort, they were an occupying army. At the far end of the vast chamber, Thomas Blackwood scrambled frantically down from his oversized mahogany throne. The local alpha was a pathetic, chaotic mess. His fine emerald silk tunic was heavily wrinkled from a sleepless night of pacing, and his face was entirely drained of color, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen grey. He stumbled over the hem of his own decorative cape, his polished leather boots slipping awkwardly on the marble as he desperately tried to project a calm, diplomatic authority that he fundamentally lacked. "High King Alistair," Thomas stammered loudly, his voice cracking and echoing pathetically in the frozen, silent hall. He forced himself to remain standing, though his violently trembling hands betrayed the sheer panic threatening to stop his heart. We were not expecting the honor of your arrival. The winter passes are supposed to be completely snowed in. If you had sent a raven, we would have prepared a proper welcome for the crown." Alistair did not stop walking. He moved down the center of the vast hall, his heavy boots crushing the delicate, discarded silk napkins and crushed golden goblets left over from the ruined feast. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His tone was a low, dangerous, gravelly rumble that effortlessly carried to every dark, trembling corner of the room. "The Treaty of Ashenir does not wait for a formal invitation, Thomas," the sovereign stated coldly, coming to a slow, deliberate halt, exactly 10 paces from the dais. His thunderous gaze, sharp and endlessly predatory, locked onto the trembling local leader. "And I have no interest in your hollow, rotting welcomes. I smell failing wards. I smell broken laws. And I smell a pack that is actively decaying from the inside out because its foundation has been ripped away." Thomas swallowed hard, a loud, nervous sound in the crushing quiet. Sweat beaded heavily at his temples, despite the freezing winds swirling through the shattered gates. "The borders are merely experiencing a temporary magical fluctuation, sire. A minor disruption during the solstice transition. Everything is completely under my control." Before the High King could systematically tear that pathetic lie apart, a fragile, high-pitched voice desperately interrupted the tense standoff. "We welcome you to our sovereign home, my king." Lyra Thorne stepped out from the shadows of the dais, desperately trying to salvage her rapidly crumbling fantasy. The mistress wore a gown of heavy, pale pink velvet, explicitly chosen to mimic the delicate elegance of true royalty. She lifted her chin, attempting to channel a regal, unbothered grace, and dramatically raised her right hand to prominently display the lunar crest ring to the terrifying monarch. The ancient moonstone sat on her finger, cloudy, dead and entirely devoid of any magical light. "I am Lyra," the woman announced, her sweet, melodic tone dripping with a desperate, venomous ambition. She offered a perfectly rehearsed, polite smile that was beautiful the way a winter frost is beautiful, sharp, shallow, and entirely lethal to anything warm. "Luna of the Blackwood Pack, if the High Crown requires hospitality, I will personally see that your men are quartered and fed." Alistair Sterling did not blink. He did not frown. He did not acknowledge her spoken words with even a single microscopic twitch of his facial muscles. Instead, the High Wolf King executed the most profound, devastating insult possible in the hierarchy of the packs. He completely and utterly looked right through her. His imposing, silver-flecked eyes swept smoothly over the spot where the mistress stood, registering her physical presence with the exact same level of passing, apathetic interest one might give to a slightly crooked chair or a stain on a rug. He did not address her. He did not correct her title. He simply erased her entire existence with a single, sweeping, freezing glance, returning his intense, lethal focus entirely back to the sweating, trembling alpha. The public humiliation was instantaneous and absolute. Lyra's perfectly rehearsed, delicate smile fractured violently. A hot, ugly, blotchy red flush rapidly crawled up her neck and aggressively stained her pale cheeks. Her hand, still raised to display the dead, stolen ring, began to tremble uncontrollably. By completely refusing to even look at her, the supreme sovereign of the realm had just explicitly communicated to every single kneeling noble in the room that she was absolutely nothing. She was a ghost. She was a cosmic joke, not even worth the breath it would take to condemn her. I did not ride for 5 days through a blizzard to trade empty pleasantries with a coward. Alistair continued smoothly to Thomas, his voice dropping an octave, the sound vibrating heavily against the marble pillars. The ancient laws mandate that the Highland alliances are anchored by a legitimate, fated ruler. You have severed a sacred bond. You have violated the absolute terms of our treaties. Where is the true lunar of this keep? Thomas panicked. His eyes darted wildly toward the heavy wooden doors at the rear of the hall, the exact path his discarded mate had taken months ago. She is no longer recognized by this court, sire. She is a servant. A traitor who refuses to speak her oaths. Alistair's eyes narrowed, a microscopic, dangerous shift. He absorbed the information instantly, his brilliant, strategic mind locking onto the word refuses. Without another word to the false king, Alistair turned sharply on his heel. His heavy direwolf cloak flared dramatically behind him as he bypassed the trembling nobility, marching purposefully toward the rear of the grand hall. Garrick Dane stepped smoothly forward, his hand still resting on his sword, physically blocking Thomas from following his sovereign. "Stay exactly where you are, little Alpha." The battle hardened. Captain warned in a low, gravelly threat, his scarred face entirely devoid of mercy. The High King will conduct his own investigation. Alistair pushed through the heavy oak doors, instantly leaving the cloying, nauseating scent of jasmine and the pathetic, whimpering politics of the upper court behind. He found himself standing at the top of a long, dark, spiraling stone staircase. The physical environment shifted drastically the moment he began his descent. The temperature dropped, but the freezing, biting wind of the highland storm was slowly replaced by a heavy, radiating subterranean heat. The air grew incredibly dense. It smelled of raw earth, sharp wood smoke, boiling iron, and the stark, uncompromising reality of survival. It was an honest scent. It was the scent of the unyielding foundation that kept the rotting castle above from entirely collapsing. The Supreme Samson reached the bottom of the steps and walked slowly into the sprawling, cavernous, subterranean kitchens. The moment his massive, dark-armored frame stepped into the erratic, flickering glow of the massive iron hearths, the chaotic, rhythmic noise of the cellar ceased. It did not stop with the pathetic, terrified gasps of the upper nobility. It stopped with a cold, highly observant, tactical silence. Dozens of soot-stained servants, butchers, and kitchen boys froze in place. They did not drop to their knees. They did not whimper in biological submission. They simply gripped their heavy iron skillets and sharp meat cleavers a little tighter, their exhausted eyes tracking the terrifying intruder with wary, protective intensity. Alistair respected them instantly. They were the invisible, calloused hands of the keep, and they were not afraid of the dark. His sharp, predatory gaze swept methodically across the sprawling, damp room, scanning past the bubbling cauldrons and the heavy wooden prep tables. Then he found her. At the absolute furthest, darkest corner of the cellars, kneeling beside a heavy, grease-stained iron grate, was Seren Vantrell. She wore a simple, unadorned dress of rough, undyed wool that was heavily stained with soot and damp from the harsh, soapy water of her endless labor. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, several strands plastered to her pale forehead by the intense heat of the nearby fires. But it was her posture that completely arrested the High King's attention. Despite kneeling on the brutal, unforgiving cobblestones, her spine was a perfectly straight rod of forged steel. She possessed the innate, unteachable, biological geometry of a true, undisputed queen. She did not immediately stop her work when he entered. She calmly, methodically finished scrubbing the heavy iron bar with her stiff, bristled brush, ensuring the task was complete before she deliberately set the tool down into a bucket of steaming water. Only then did she slowly, gracefully rise to her feet. She wiped her raw, fiercely blistered hands on her coarse linen apron. She turned to face the most powerful, terrifying man in the known world. She did not flinch. She did not lower her chin. She did not avert her eyes. Alistair walked slowly across the damp, soapy cobblestones. The heavy, rhythmic thud of his steel-toed boots echoed loudly in the absolute, crushing silence of the kitchen. He stopped precisely 3 feet away from her, aggressively invading her physical space, projecting the full, terrifying, crushing weight of his sovereign aura directly onto her shoulders. It was a test. A brutal, psychological pressure designed to instantly break liars and cowards. Seren absorbed the immense, suffocating weight of his presence without a single tremor. Her inner wolf did not pace. It did not cower. It calmly stepped forward in the dark recesses of her mind, sitting perfectly still, analyzing the massive, dangerous predator standing before them with absolute equal measure. Alistair's right hand moved smoothly, deliberately to his hip. With a sharp, lethal hiss of metal sliding against leather, he drew Stellivore. The ancient, sacred sword of the High Crown was a terrifying masterpiece of lethal artistry. The blade was forged from a dark, meteoritic steel that seemed to actively consume the erratic, flickering light of the hearth fires. Etched deeply into the center of the heavy metal were ancient, jagged silver runes. As the sword was drawn, the runes instantly flared to life, glowing with a cold, piercing, luminescent silver magic that caused the ambient temperature in the immediate vicinity to plummet aggressively. Frost immediately began to rapidly crystallize along the damp cobblestones surrounding his heavy boots. Alistair raised the massive weapon with effortless, terrifying strength. He leveled the razor-sharp tip of the glowing blade directly at the exact center of her chest, halting the lethal steel barely a single inch from the rough, soot-stained wool of her dress. The ambient magic radiating off the ancient sword was intensely cold, a physical, biting chill that seeped instantly through her thin garments, raising the fine hairs on her arms. "You are Seren of the House Vantrell," Alistair stated. It was not a question. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble, a sound that bypassed her ears and vibrated directly against her ribs. "You have been stripped of your title, cast into the dark and replaced by a fraud. Yet, your alpha claims you refuse to speak the oath of submission to his new court." The High King stepped 1/2 inch closer. The glowing, silver-rund tip of Stellivore lightly brushed the fabric of her dress. "Kneel before the High Crown," Alistair commanded softly, the quiet volume of his voice infinitely more terrifying than a roaring shout. "Speak your name, and explain your treason to the realm." Seren looked down at the ancient, lethal blade pointed directly at her heart. She analytically catalogued the intricate glowing silver runes, the flawless deadly edge of the dark steel, and the absolute, unwavering steadiness of the massive hand holding it. She knew exactly what this man was capable of. She knew he had legally executed entire bloodlines for insubordination. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her head. She locked her stormy, silver-grey eyes directly onto his sharp, predatory storm-grey gaze. She did not gasp in fear. She did not clutch her chest in panic. She did not open her mouth to desperately plead for her life, to frantically explain the agonizing, hollow void of her severed mate bond, or to violently curse the coward sitting on the throne above. She closed her lips into a hard, unbreakable, unyielding iron line. She simply stood there, a quiet, immovable mountain of cold stone fiercely holding the terrifying gaze of the supreme sovereign. Her silence was not a passive, frightened retreat. It was a heavy, dense, and physically absolute weapon. It expanded outward from her unbent spine, a tangible, living entity that aggressively pushed back against the freezing, lethal aura of the ancient sword. The silence stretched between them for one agonizing, endless minute. Then, too, the only sounds in the sprawling cavern were the frantic, popping crackle of the massive hearth fires and the heavy, terrified, collective heartbeat of the dozens of kitchen servants holding their breath in the shadows. Alistair Sterling stared intensely into her stormy eyes. He searched deeply for a single microscopic flicker of panic, a single tremor of submission, a single crack in her psychological armor. He found absolutely nothing but solid, impenetrable, unyielding iron. He saw a woman who had already survived the absolute destruction of her entire world and had meticulously rebuilt her own fortress out of the ashes. She was actively choosing silence. She was consciously weaponizing her own dignity against the legal demands of his sword. The corners of the monarch's mouth twitched, a microscopic, almost imperceptible shift that completely betrayed the terrifying, legendary stoicism of the cursed monarch. He didn't see a broken, displaced servant kneeling in the dirt. He saw a brilliant, tactical mastermind who was actively utilizing the ancient laws of the realm, better than any highly educated noble in his own court. By completely refusing to speak, she could not be legally compelled to legitimize the false Alpha's crown. Her silence was not a surrender. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof that the Blackwood throne was entirely fraudulent. Alistair did not lower the sword. He kept the glowing tip of Stellavore perfectly steady against her chest, the cold magic swirling violently between them, binding them in a heavy, highly intellectual, and deeply dangerous game of absolute stillness. The heavy, suffocating silence in the subterranean kitchens stretched into an agonizing eternity. The glowing, silver-rund tip of Stellavore hovered a fraction of an inch from the rough, soot-stained wool covering Seren's heart. The ancient magic of the blade radiated a biting, absolute zero cold, aggressively warring against the blistering, honest heat of the massive iron hearths behind her. Frost continued to crystallize in delicate, spidery patterns across the damp cobblestones surrounding Alistair's heavy steel-toed boots, creeping slowly toward the hem of her grease-stained dress. The cold was not merely atmospheric. It was ancient, a biological suppression designed to freeze the blood of traitors before they could even draw a weapon. The intense drop in temperature caused the ambient moisture in the cellar to turn into a thin, swirling mist, isolating the two of them in a frozen, highly charged vacuum. Yet the displaced queen did not so much as shiver. She maintained her unyielding, upward gaze, her stormy, silver-grey eyes locked entirely onto the terrifying predator standing before her. Alistair Sterling, the supreme High Wolf King of the ancient realm, slowly lowered his weapon. The movement was deliberate, smooth, and entirely lacking in the aggressive, jerky posturing of lesser men. He did not break eye contact as the razor-sharp tip of the meteoritic steel dropped toward the floor. He saw her. He looked past the bruises, the exhaustion, and the filthy servant's garb, instantly recognizing the immense, terrifying willpower required to stand at the edge of a lethal blade without begging for mercy. "You did not lose your voice to trauma," the sovereign murmured. The low, dangerous gravel of his tone bypassed the ambient noise of the crackling fires, vibrating directly against the stone walls of the cavernous room. "You did not retreat into your own mind out of fear. You built a fortress out of the one thing they could never legally strip from you." Seren did not blink. Her inner wolf, previously sitting quietly in the dark recesses of her mind, slowly tilted its head, observing the massive, dark-armored man with a newfound, profound respect. It was the first time in months her beast had felt the presence of an equal, a predator, who recognized the lethal power of absolute stillness. The High King sheathed Stellivore. The sharp, lethal hiss of the ancient steel sliding back into its heavy leather scabbard was the loudest sound in the sprawling cellar. The moment the blade was entirely concealed, the aggressive, freezing magic instantly dissipated, allowing the heavy, comforting warmth of the underground ovens to rush back into the space. The frost on the cobblestones began to rapidly melt, turning into small, dark puddles of water reflecting the erratic orange light of the fires. "The Treaty of Ashenir," Alistair continued, his sharp, storm-grey gaze analytically sweeping over her raw, fiercely blistered hands before returning to her stoic face. "It is a sacred pact forged in the blood of our ancestors. It explicitly dictates that a fated mate bond cannot be legally overwritten by a ruling alpha without the vocal, witnessed consent of the displaced party. The law was written centuries ago to prevent ambitious tyrants from casually discarding their true anchors for shallow political convenience." Alistair took a slow, deliberate half-step back, granting her the physical space a true equal deserved. His massive direwolf fur cloak settled heavily against the dark steel of his armor. Thomas believed he could simply demote you to the shadows, strip your ring, and force a new coronation, the king stated, his voice a calm, inevitable execution of logic. He believed your exile was the end of his inconvenience. But by refusing to speak a single word of submission, by completely denying him the vocal oath he so desperately needed to finalize the transition, you have actively kept his entire new regime in a state of legal purgatory. The dozens of exhausted kitchen servants, butchers, and scullery boys, hiding in the shadows of the hanging meats, held their collective breath. They listened in absolute awe as the most powerful man in the known world systematically validated the grueling, invisible war their silent queen had been waging on their behalf. Martha Crowley stood near the massive flour barrels, her weathered hands pressed tightly over her mouth to stifle a sob of pure, overwhelming vindication. "His court is rotting," Alistair declared, his eyes flashing with a predatory, intellectual satisfaction. "The biological magic of the pack recognizes that the transition was never formally completed. The wards are failing. The solstice blessings are dead. Your silence is not a surrender, Seren Vantrell. It is a highly calculated, devastating siege." Seren absorbed the validation without a single outward flicker of emotion. She did not smile triumphantly. She did not release a heavy sigh of relief. She simply stood her ground, a mountain of cold stone, absorbing the reality that her months of agonizing, punishing discipline had successfully broken the foundation of the very keep that sought to bury her. The iron-hard tension in her shoulders remained. She had survived this long by trusting no one, and a few true words from a High King would not magically undo the brutal survival instincts she had forged in the dark. "Come with me," Alistair commanded softly. It was not a violent, aggressive demand. It was the calm, inevitable pull of a shifting tide. He turned his broad back to her, a gesture of absolute, terrifying trust from a man who was surrounded by heavily armed, fiercely protective kitchen workers. He began to walk toward the dark, spiraling stone staircase that led back to the world above. Seren did not hesitate. She wiped her raw, heavily blistered hands on her coarse linen apron one final time. She did not look back at the bubbling iron cauldrons or the heavy grates she had spent grueling months scrubbing until her knuckles bled. She stepped away from the wooden prep table, falling perfectly into step behind the High King. The ascent was a stark, psychological transition. As they climbed the damp, uneven stone steps, the comforting, honest sense of wood smoke, roasted root vegetables, and raw earth slowly faded away. They were aggressively replaced by the nauseating, cloying stench of jasmine perfume and the metallic tang of sour wine that seeped down from the upper levels. It was the scent of corruption, of a pack attempting to mask its own decay with shallow pageantry. The temperature dropped significantly with every vertical foot they conquered. The residual heat of the cellars gave way entirely to the biting, shrieking howl of the highland blizzard that was currently tearing relentlessly through the shattered front gates above. Seren's thin leather shoes made absolutely no sound on the stairs. She was a silent ghost rising from her own grave, bringing the absolute, crushing weight of her unbroken spine back to the world of the living. The heavy oak doors at the top of the stairwell were already wide open. When Alistair Sterling stepped back into the grand hall, the oppressive, terrifying weight of his sovereign aura washed over the room all over again. The exhausted, paranoid nobles who had dared to lift their heads instantly slammed their foreheads back down against the freezing marble floor. The 24 silver-armored soldiers of the High Guard stood in perfect, deadly, statuesque formations, completely controlling the perimeter with lethal efficiency. But the collective, terrified gasp that rippled through the kneeling crowd was not for the High King. It was for the woman walking quietly behind him. Seren stepped fully into the dim, bruised morning twilight of the ruined hall. She was entirely covered in soot, grease, and the undeniable filth of the lowest caste. Her simple, undyed wool dress was stained and ragged at the hem, yet she walked with the innate, unteachable geometry of a true sovereign. Her chin was held high, her silver-grey eyes sweeping over the kneeling nobility with an icy, impenetrable apathy. She did not look like a broken servant being dragged before the court for judgment. She looked like the judge arriving to oversee an execution, beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. At the far end of the vast freezing chamber, Thomas Blackwood was still physically detained by Garrick Dane. The battle-hardened captain stood slightly behind the local alpha, his heavy, gauntleted hand resting casually but lethally on the hilt of his broadsword, offering a silent, undeniable warning against any sudden movements. When Thomas saw his discarded mate emerge from the shadows, his ashen face drained of whatever meager blood remained in his veins. His wrinkled emerald tunic, a garment that was supposed to project wealth and unquestionable authority, now clung to him like a cheap costume. The heavy gold chains around his neck looked ridiculous in the presence of true ancestral sovereignty. The overwhelming smell of his sudden, sharp spike of terror completely overpowered the lingering jasmine in the immediate vicinity. "What is the meaning of this?" Thomas stammered loudly, his voice cracking violently in the cold air. Desperation made him incredibly foolish. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to project a manufactured dominance through his sweat-stained collar. "Why have you brought that servant back into my hall? I explicitly banished her to the cellars to rot." Alistair did not stop walking until he was precisely in the center of the vast room, standing on the exact spot where Seren had been brutally rejected months prior. He turned slightly, deliberately allowing the silent, soot-stained woman to stand shoulder to shoulder with him, visually establishing her as an absolute equal in the eyes of the terrified court. "You did not banish a servant, Thomas," Alistair stated, his low voice effortlessly cutting through the howling wind pouring in from the shattered iron gates. "You attempted to bury a tactical genius who understood the ancient laws of this realm better than the coward wearing the crown." Lyra Thorne, shivering violently in her pale pink velvet gown near the edge of the dais, let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. She clutched her arms tightly around her chest, desperately trying to hide the dead, cloudy lunar crest ring on her finger from the ruler's predatory, sweeping gaze. Her fragile, beautiful facade was completely crumbling under the sheer atmospheric pressure of true authority. "She is a traitor!" Thomas yelled, spittle flying from his pale lips. The sheer, unhinged panic of a cornered animal was completely taking over his rational mind, making him blind to the lethal danger, standing 3 paces away. She refused to speak the oath of submission to the new court. She deliberately incited a silent rebellion among the lower caste. Her silence is proof of her treason. The entire grand hall held its breath. The accusation hung heavily in the freezing air, a desperate, final attempt by the false alpha to control the rapidly deteriorating narrative. Alistair Sterling looked at the trembling man. The corners of Alistair's mouth twitched, forming a cold, terrifying phantom of a smile that was entirely devoid of any mercy. "You are absolutely correct, Thomas," Alistair said smoothly. The quiet, controlled volume of his agreement sent a visible, violent shudder down the spines of every noble in the room. Her silence is the ultimate proof of treason. The sovereign slowly, deliberately raised his right hand, pointing a single, leather-gloved finger directly at the alpha. "But the treason is yours." Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but Alistair's voice suddenly boomed, vibrating heavily with the ancient biological magic of the supreme bloodline. It was a sound that commanded the very foundations of the stone keep to listen. An auditory shockwave that pressed physically against the eardrums of every wolf present. By the sacred, immutable laws of the Treaty of Ashania, a fated mate bond cannot be forcefully overwritten without the vocal, witnessed consent of the displaced, the High King declared, his words striking the freezing air like heavy iron hammers. Seren Vantrell never spoke the oath. She never relinquished her legal, biological authority over this pack. Therefore, your subsequent coronation of this impostor is a direct illegal usurpation of a recognized sovereign seat. Alistair took one heavy, deliberate step toward the dais. The ambient temperature in the room plummeted further, thick layers of frost rapidly climbing up the ornate gilded pillars and coating the discarded golden goblets scattered on the floor. "You have attempted to rule through a completely fraudulent transition," Alistair continued, mercilessly, systematically dismantling the man's entire existence with precise legal surgical strikes. "You have violently severed a fated bond without legal completion, completely destabilizing the Highland borders and actively endangering the outer packs by letting your wards decay. You are not a king. You are an illegitimate rebel squatting on a stolen throne." Thomas staggered backward, his fine, polished leather boots slipping awkwardly on the frost-covered marble. The crushing, biological reality of his decree hit him with the blunt force of a physical avalanche. The artificial alpha aura that Thomas had so arrogantly projected for years instantly shattered, evaporating completely into the freezing wind. His inner wolf immediately tucked its tail, whining pathetically in the dark corners of his mind as it was forcefully dominated and crushed by a vastly superior predator. "No," Thomas gasped, shaking his head frantically, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. "I am the Alpha of Blackwood, my bloodline. Your bloodline ends today," Alistair interrupted, his voice dropping back to that terrifying lethal gravel. He turned his head slightly, his storm-grey eyes locking onto his captain. "Garrick." "Strip him." Garrick Dane moved with brutal, highly trained efficiency. The veteran captain grabbed the heavy, decorative emerald silk cape fastened to Thomas's shoulders and violently ripped it away. The sound of tearing fabric echoed loudly in the silent hall, a sharp, defining crack that finalized the destruction of the old regime. Garrick ruthlessly kicked the back of the false king's knees, forcefully driving Thomas face first onto the freezing hard marble floor with a sickening thud. Lyra screamed, a sharp, hysterical, grating sound that entirely shattered the remaining shreds of dignity in the court. She tried to run toward the heavy mahogany doors behind the throne, her pale pink velvet skirts tangling awkwardly around her legs, completely abandoning the mate she had conspired with. "Secure the impostor," Alistair commanded, not even bothering to turn his head to look at her fleeing form. 2 silver-armored guards moved with blinding, supernatural speed. They intercepted the mistress before she could even take 5 steps, grabbing her arms violently and forcing her to her knees on the hard, unforgiving stone. She sobbed openly, large, ugly tears streaking through the heavy powder on her face, entirely stripping away the delicate illusion of royalty she had worn for months. "Take the ring," the High King ordered, his gaze still fixed coldly on the weeping, broken man pinned to the floor. One of the elite guards grabbed Lyra's right hand. She shrieked, desperately curling her fingers into a tight fist to protect her stolen prize, but the soldier effortlessly pried her hand open. With a sharp, uncaring pull, he stripped the heavy, ancient lunar crest ring from her index finger. The violent removal left a raw, bright red scrape across her pale skin. The guard walked silently over to Alistair, bowed his head in absolute reverence, and placed the cloudy moonstone into the sovereign's waiting, leather-gloved palm. Alistair looked down at the dead relic, a symbol of ancient authority that had been so horribly defiled, then slowly closed his massive fist around it, keeping it safe. Heavy, cold iron chains were abruptly dropped onto the marble floor beside Thomas. The loud, metallic clatter made the kneeling nobles flinch collectively, the sound echoing like a death knell off the vaulted ceiling. Garrick roughly pulled the false Alpha's arms behind his back, securing the heavy iron shackles tightly around his wrists. The cold metal hissed as it bit deeply into Thomas's bare skin, a harsh, physical manifestation of his absolute, permanent ruin. His golden eyes, once bright with arrogant ambition, were completely dilated with terror. He looked up, frantically searching the room for a single ally, a single pack member willing to stand in his defense. Every single head remained bowed, every single eye was fixed on the frozen marble. He was completely, irrevocably alone. Throughout the entire violent dismantling of the Blackwood crown, Seren Vantrell did not move a single muscle. She stood perfectly straight in her soot-stained dress, the biting Highland wind whipping her loose, dark hair around her pale face. She watched the man who had publicly humiliated her, who had brutally severed their sacred bond for a cheap illusion, get reduced to a whimpering, chained prisoner on his own floor. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She did not offer a single tear of pity or relief. She simply observed the brutal, mathematical scales of justice finally balancing themselves out. Her silence remained absolute. She did not need to scream her victory to the heavens. She did not need to hurl vindictive insults at the weeping mistress or the broken man bleeding on the frost-covered marble. The High King had done exactly what she knew he would do. He had taken the heavy, unyielding weapon of her silence and used it to legally and permanently shatter an entire kingdom on her behalf. The biting wind continued to howl violently through the shattered iron gates, tearing at the heavy crimson velvet banners that hung from the vaulted ceiling. The storm outside was completely merciless, but it was nothing compared to the freezing, lethal, killing frost of Alistair Stirling's justice inside the grand hall. The nobles remained pressed against the frost-covered marble floor, completely immobilized by the crushing primal weight of Alistair Stirling's presence. Every single lord and lady who had laughed at her displacement now trembled in the dirt. The only sounds in the cavernous, freezing chamber were the pathetic, ragged sobs of the fallen mistress and the sharp, metallic clinking of the heavy iron chains currently binding Thomas Blackwood's wrists. Alistair deliberately turned his broad, armor-clad back on the ruined Alpha. He completely dismissed the chained man's existence, stripping him of even the basic dignity of a final executioner's glance. The supreme sovereign of the ancient realm focused his intense, storm-grey gaze entirely upon the woman standing silently at his side. Seren Vantrell had not moved. She stood perfectly straight, her thin leather shoes planted firmly on the freezing stone. The soot and grease from the subterranean cellars heavily stained her undyed wool dress, painting a stark, undeniable visual contrast against the polished, gleaming silver armor of the elite High Guard surrounding them. Her knuckles were raw, her hem was frayed, yet, in the bruised, dim morning twilight of the hall, she was the only person in the entire room who did not look small. She possessed the gravity of a dying winter sun. Unyielding, silent, absolute, Alistair looked down at his massive leather-gloved hand. With agonizing precision, he uncurled his fingers. Resting in the center of his dark palm was the lunar crest ring. The heavy silver band and the cold, cloudy moonstone had been thoroughly defiled by the frantic, desperate ambitions of a usurper. It looked like a dead, hollow thing, completely stripped of its ancient instinctual resonance. Alistair did not offer it back to her immediately. He held it out into the freezing air, allowing the terrified, kneeling court to look upon the physical manifestation of their collective treason. The pale light caught the dull edges of the gem. It was a mirror reflecting their own decay. "A pack is a living, breathing entity," Alistair stated, his low, dangerous voice echoing methodically off the gilded pillars. "It requires a true, fated foundation to thrive. It requires an anchor who understands that true power is not found in the volume of a command, but in the unyielding strength of the spine that carries it. When you allowed this ring to be stripped from its rightful bearer, you did not just humiliate a queen. You actively butchered the very soul of your own territory." His words were a heavy, physical judgment, pressing down on the backs of the local nobility. No one dared to whimper. No one dared to offer a pathetic excuse. They were entirely complicit in the decay. They had stood by and watched a true mate be cast into the damp darkness. Now, the sovereign was making sure they felt the absolute, crushing weight of their cowardice. The air grew thinner. The frost crept further across the tiles, freezing the edges of their expensive velvet cloaks. Alistair then turned his body fully toward Seren. The terrifying, elemental aura that had just brought an entire kingdom to its knees abruptly shifted. It did not disappear, but it transformed. The aggressive, crushing pressure smoothly retracted, replaced by a dense, warm, heavily protective boundary that enveloped her completely. It felt like stepping out of a blinding blizzard into the immediate, radiant heat of a massive hearth fire. It was the absolute first sensation of true, undeniable safety she had experienced since the day her world shattered. The biting chill in her marrow ceased. The trembling in her exhausted muscles vanished. "You have waged a silent war for months," Alistair murmured quietly. The gravelly rumble of his voice meant only for her ears, though the absolute silence of the room allowed the words to carry. "You endured the damp stones, the blistering heat of the cauldrons, and the petty cruelty of lesser men. You built an impenetrable fortress out of your own quiet dignity. You proved that a true sovereign does not need a throne to command the shadows." Seren looked up into his sharp, predatory eyes. She quietly traced the microscopic softening around his hard jaw, the deep, ancient respect burning in his storm, grey gaze. He was not looking at her with the shallow, fleeting warmth of a boy playing at politics. He was looking at her with the profound, recognizing hunger of a cursed monarch who had finally found the one entity in the known world capable of standing in the dark beside him without flinching. He saw her. Not the soot, not the scars. He saw the iron beneath. "But the war is over, Seren of the House Ventral," Alistair continued, his tone deepening into a sacred, formal register. "The false crown is completely broken. The treaties are shattered. Blackwood is a dead territory, rotting from the inside out. I have no interest in salvaging the ruins of a coward's legacy." The High King took a deliberate step closer. He was a massive, terrifying predator, a man who possessed the raw physical power to snap the spine of a direwolf with his bare hands. He had buried traitors, executed usurpers, and lived his entire life bound by the heavy, isolating iron chains of his own cursed, lethal bloodline. No one in the realm dared to look him in the eye. No one dared to stand within striking distance of Stellivor. The legendary blade remained sheathed at his hip, yet its lethal promise hung heavily in the air. Yet, as he stood before the soot-stained, displaced queen, Alistair Sterling did the absolute unthinkable. He deliberately lowered himself toward the freezing marble floor. The heavy, dark steel plates of his armor shifted and clanked loudly in the quiet room. His massive direwolf fur cloak pooled heavily around him as his right knee made solid, undeniable contact with the frost-covered stone. He bowed his head, baring his neck to a woman who possessed absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. A collective, strangled gasp tore violently from the throats of the surrounding nobility. The silver-armored elite guards did not move, but their eyes widened in profound, absolute shock. Thomas Blackwood, bleeding and bound in heavy iron chains just a few feet away, let out a pathetic, suffocated sound of total disbelief. His mind could not comprehend the geometry of the scene. The supreme High Wolf King of the ancient Pax, the most powerful and terrifying sovereign in the history of the realm, was willingly kneeling in the dirt before a kitchen servant. Alistair did not care about the whispers of the court. He did not care about the terrified murmurs of the dying nobility. He kept his storm-grey eyes locked entirely onto Seren's face, offering her the ultimate instinctual vulnerability a predator could display. By lowering his head beneath hers, he was actively surrendering his lethal dominance, explicitly placing his life, his crown, and his terrifying instincts completely at her mercy. The ultimate submission. He held up his leather-gloved hand, the dead lunar crest ring resting in his palm. "I do not offer you a return to this pathetic, rotting keep," Alistair said softly, his voice vibrating with a raw, desperate sincerity that completely shattered his legendary stoicism. "I do not offer you the shallow title of a local lunar. I offer you the high crown. I offer you the ancient, unbroken treaties of the sovereign realm. Come with me to the northern peaks. Stand beside me in the shadow glass halls. Be my equal, my anchor, and my true queen." Seren stared down at the massive, terrifying man kneeling at her feet. Her inner wolf, which had spent months sitting in the cold, dark silence of her mind, steadily stood up. It did not bare its teeth in defense. It let out a soft, low, instinctual rumble of absolute recognition. This was not a trap. This was not a gilded cage constructed of jasmine perfume and false promises. This was a true, fated sanctuary, a place where her strength would never be punished. "For months you have used your silence as a shield to survive," Alistair whispered, his eyes searching the deep, stormy depths of her silver-grey gaze. "You have completely starved them of your voice, letting them choke on the heavy weight of their own sins. But you do not need to hide in the dark anymore, Seren. The shield has done its job." He reached out his left hand by inches, leaving it hovering respectfully in the freezing air between them, palm open, waiting for her voluntary choice. He would not force her. He would never compel her. If she turned her back and walked away, he would let her go. Even if it meant returning to his frozen isolation forever. The physical restraint radiating from his massive frame was devastating. "Speak to me," the High King pleaded quietly, a rare, beautiful vulnerability cracking the iron facade of his voice. "Break the silence, my queen. Speak your first words to me, and let us burn this rot to the ash." The silence in the grand hall reached a staggering, critical mass. It was a heavy, suffocating physical pressure that pushed against the eardrums of every wolf in the room, threatening to completely crack the stone pillars. The howling blizzard outside seemed to momentarily pause, the freezing wind holding its breath as the absolute fate of the realm hung delicately in the balance. Even the mist from their breaths hung suspended in the freezing air. Seren Vantrell looked at the massive, leather-gloved hand, hovering in the space between them. She looked at the dead, cloudy moonstone ring resting in his other palm. She looked past the terrifying, dark steel armor and the heavy direwolf fur, staring directly into the intense, yearning depths of Alistair Stirling's storm-grey eyes. She had spent 3 grueling, punishing months meticulously building a fortress of absolute, unyielding silence. Every single day she had forcefully swallowed her pain, her righteous fury, and her devastating grief, locking it away behind an impenetrable iron door in her mind. Her silence had become her entire identity. It had been her armor, her weapon, and her only reliable companion in the dark, damp cellars. Giving it up felt like stepping off a massive, sheer cliff into an endless, terrifying void. But as she looked at the High King, kneeling willingly on the frost-covered marble, the heavy, biting chill in her veins began to finally recede. The intense, radiating warmth of his protective aura seeped deeply into her skin, gently thawing the frozen, bruised edges of her soul. He was not asking her to surrender her strength. He was asking her to transition from a solitary survivor into a supreme conqueror. He was offering her a sword to replace her shield. With deliberate care, Seren raised her raw, fiercely blistered right hand. The skin on her knuckles was cracked and peeling from months of harsh lye soap and boiling water, a stark, undeniable physical testament to her brutal labor. She did not try to hide the ugly, calloused scars. She wore them with absolute, unapologetic pride. She reached out and placed her small, battered hand directly into the massive, leather-gloved palm of the High King. Alistair's fingers immediately closed around hers. His grip was incredibly strong, yet painfully gentle, an absolute deliberate exercise in restraint. The physical contact was an electric shockwave, a sudden blinding rush of pure, fated magic that violently arsed up her arm and struck directly at the center of her chest. The hollow, agonizing void left by Thomas's betrayal was instantly flooded with a thick, golden, molten heat. It tasted like ash and wild honey. It felt like coming home. Seren parted her lips. The muscles in her throat felt incredibly tight, stiff, and foreign after months of total disuse. She took a deep, measuring breath, drawing the honest scent of ozone, and crushed pine needles deep into her lungs, completely washing away the nauseating stench of the jasmine perfume that had poisoned this hall. "I accept," Seren said. Her voice was low, incredibly raspy, and deeply textured by the long, punishing months of disuse. It was not a loud, theatrical shout. It was a quiet, devastatingly calm declaration of absolute power. The moment the 2 syllables left her lips, the physical world violently reacted. The ancient magic of the realm, which had been actively starving under the fraudulent rule of the false Alpha, recognized the spoken oath of a true sovereign. A blinding, explosive wave of pure, pearlescent light erupted from the center of the hall. The dead, cloudy moonstone in the lunar crest ring suddenly ignited, burning with a fierce, brilliant, internal fire that completely banished the dim, bruised twilight of the room. The intense light surged down Alistair's arm, wrapping around their joined hands, sealing the new unbroken treaty with a highly visible, undeniable instinctual mandate. Alistair's eyes flared with a terrifying, golden, predatory satisfaction. He smoothly picked up the glowing ring and slid it precisely onto her raw, blistered index finger. The ancient silver band immediately adjusted, shrinking slightly to fit her perfectly, branding her with the undeniable authority of the High Crown. It no longer felt cold. It burned with a fierce, loyal heat. "No!" Thomas screamed from the floor. The chained, broken man thrashed violently against the freezing marble, his heavy iron shackles clanking loudly in a pathetic, desperate display of total ruin. He could physically feel the last, lingering threads of the pack magic actively tearing away from his bloodline, rushing eagerly toward the soot-stained woman he had so foolishly discarded. The instinctual severance was agonizing. "She is a servant. She is nothing. You cannot do this." Garrick Dane moved with brutal, unforgiving speed, The battle-hardened captain slammed the heavy, steel-plated heel of his boot directly into the center of Thomas's back, forcefully driving the false Alpha's face hard against the frost-covered stone. The sickening crack of a broken nose echoed through the hall. "Silence, traitor," Garrick snarled, his scarred face a mask of absolute, lethal disgust. "You are addressing Seren, the true queen. Your right to speak in this hall has been permanently revoked." The former king choked on a mouthful of his own blood, his golden eyes wide with absolute, terrifying realization. He had spent his entire life desperately craving vocal validation, demanding oaths and blessings to prop up his fragile ego. Now, he was permanently silenced, doomed to rot in the very dark, forgotten dungeons he had so arrogantly designed for his fated mate. He watched, utterly helpless, as the woman he had thrown away effortlessly commanded the absolute devotion of the most dangerous predator in the world. He had traded a diamond for dirt, and now the dirt was burying him. Alistair rose smoothly to his feet, bringing Seren up with him. He did not release her hand. With his free arm he unclasped the massive, heavy direwolf fur cloak from his own armored shoulders, and draped it gently over her thin, shivering frame. The heavy, dark fur immediately enveloped her in absolute, intense warmth. It smelled heavily of winter storms, old leather, and the deeply comforting, masculine scent of the sovereign. It was a highly visible, physical shield, a royal declaration that she was completely, unconditionally protected. The weight of the fur settled over her like a promise forged in iron and blood. "Captain," Alistair commanded, his voice returning to its terrifying, booming authority. "Burn the Ashenir treaties, confiscate the keep's armory, and empty their vaults. This territory is officially stripped of its rank and protection. Let the winter winds claim whatever is left of this rotting court." "Yes, my king," the captain replied, instantly signaling his elite silver-armored guards to begin the systematic dismantling of the Blackwood legacy. Alistair looked down at Seren. The cold, terrifying mask he wore for the world was completely gone, replaced by a deep, unwavering loyalty that would gladly reduce 1,000 kingdoms to ash just to see her safe. "Are you ready to leave this grave, my queen?" he asked softly. Seren looked out over the kneeling, shivering nobles. She looked at the weeping, shattered mistress crawling on the floor, and the bleeding, chained coward who had once promised her the world. She felt absolutely nothing for them, no anger, no pity. The heavy, sharp teeth of her unspoken name had finally snapped shut, consuming the traitors entirely. The pack was dead, but she was alive. She pulled the heavy direwolf fur tightly around her shoulders, completely burying the soot-stained wool of her servant's dress beneath the mantle of a supreme sovereign. She lifted her chin, her spine a perfectly straight rod of forged steel, and locked her stormy, silver-grey eyes on the shattered iron gates ahead. The wind outside howled a wild, approving song. "I am," she replied, her raspy voice steady and unbreakable. "Let us go home." They walked out of the ruined hall together, their footsteps echoing perfectly in sync across the crushed marble. They did not look back. They left the false Alpha bleeding in his heavy iron chains, trapped in a cold, decaying cavern of his own making, desperately begging for a second chance that was far too late. The Shadowstone Keep still stands at the edge of the jagged highland pines, though it is nothing more than a hollow, rotting shell. The locals say the halls are haunted now, not by the dead, but by the heavy, crushing memory of a silent woman who brought a false king to his knees without shedding a single tear. Some nights, when the winter blizzard howls through the shattered iron gates, you can still hear the faint, metallic clink of heavy iron chains, and the pathetic, desperate weeping of a coward who realized the true value of his anchor long after the ship had already sailed.